Racist cop arrests Supreme Court justice. What happens next changes everything. Some stories make you question whether justice is really blind, or whether first impressions can shape everything that follows. Imagine being judged before a single fact is known, then watching one decision set off consequences no one could have predicted. Could this entire situation have been avoided, or was it destined to expose something much deeper? Welcome to HOA Stories. Today, you'll witness a story where assumptions are tested, professionalism is challenged, and one ordinary encounter leaves everyone involved seeing justice in a completely different way. Let's get started. The most dangerous judgments are the ones made before a single question is asked. On a crisp autumn morning in Washington, District of Columbia, traffic flowed steadily beneath a clear blue sky as commuters hurried toward another ordinary workday, unaware that within the next few minutes, one routine traffic stop would quietly begin a story remembered far beyond the streets where it unfolded. Officer Ryan Walker had already completed nearly 6 years with the Metropolitan Police Department. At 38 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed experience had taught him how to read people before they spoke. His patrol vehicle rolled through downtown with practiced precision, the familiar sounds of dispatch calls filling the cabin while sunlight reflected across government buildings standing proudly against the morning horizon. For Ryan, every shift followed the same rhythm. Observe. Decide. Act. It was a formula he trusted without hesitation. A routine radio broadcast interrupted the quiet drive. All units, be advised. A dark grey sedan matching a witness description was last seen traveling toward the downtown Federal District. Partial plate information is unavailable. Use caution and verify identification if located. The transmission was brief and offered few details. It did not authorize an arrest or identify a suspect. It simply instructed officers to verify any vehicle reasonably matching the description before allowing it to continue. A few blocks away, a dark grey sedan waited patiently at a red light. Behind the wheel sat a distinguished black man in his early 60s wearing a simple navy suit with a neatly folded white pocket square. His silver hair framed a calm, thoughtful face that revealed decades of discipline rather than privilege. His name was Elijah Brooks. To the people passing on the sidewalk, he appeared to be nothing more than another professional beginning his day. No security detail surrounded him. No official motorcade announced his presence. He preferred it that way. His greatest belief was that respect should never depend on recognition. As the traffic light turned green, Elijah continued driving toward the Supreme Court building where another demanding day awaited him. He glanced briefly at the marble columns rising in the distance before returning his attention to the road ahead. Moments later, Ryan noticed the sedan while monitoring traffic. Dark grey. 4-door. Heading toward the same area mentioned in the broadcast. From a distance, it appeared generally consistent with the limited description dispatch had provided only moments earlier. Ryan checked the vehicle once more before activating his emergency lights. At that moment, he believed conducting a brief investigative stop was both reasonable and consistent with department procedure. Within seconds, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the quiet street behind Elijah's vehicle. The sedan slowed smoothly before pulling safely onto the shoulder without hesitation. Elijah switched off the engine, lowered the driver's side window, and calmly rested both hands where they remained clearly visible. Ryan stepped from his patrol vehicle with measured confidence, adjusting the camera attached to his uniform before approaching. The morning breeze carried the distant sounds of city traffic as pedestrians slowed just enough to notice another routine stop unfolding along the busy avenue. Ryan stopped beside the open window. "Good morning, sir. License and registration, please." Elijah offered a polite smile before reaching carefully for the requested documents. "Certainly, officer." His voice remained steady, courteous, and completely relaxed. Ryan accepted the documents and performed the initial review expected during an investigative stop. Everything appeared orderly. Nothing immediately suggested criminal activity. Still, as he looked from the driver's license back to Elijah's face, a quiet doubt lingered in his mind. The broadcast had offered only fragments. The man before him did not fully match the picture Ryan had begun constructing in his own imagination. Instead of allowing the growing differences to reduce his suspicion, Ryan found himself searching for reasons to keep it alive. Elijah noticed the subtle change immediately but remained composed. Years of public service had taught him that dignity often began with patience. Ryan asked him to step out of the vehicle while he completed additional verification. Elijah complied without argument, closing the door gently behind him before standing quietly beside the sedan beneath the cool morning sunlight. Curious onlookers paused along the sidewalk as the flashing patrol lights reflected against nearby windows. Ryan believed he was exercising careful police work. He had no way of knowing that the man standing calmly before him carried one of the highest responsibilities in the American justice system, or that the choices he made over the next few minutes would reveal the difference between following evidence and following assumption, transforming not only his career but his understanding of justice itself. Ryan Walker maintained a steady expression as he looked from Elijah Brooks to the quiet sedan parked along the curb, convinced that although several details no longer matched the limited broadcast, too many unanswered questions remained to simply end the stop. "Please keep your hands where I can see them," he said evenly. Elijah gave a respectful nod and complied without hesitation. "Of course, officer." The older man stood with remarkable composure, neither defensive nor argumentative, while morning commuters slowed their pace just enough to observe the unexpected scene before continuing toward their destinations. Ryan circled the vehicle, peering through each window with careful attention. The interior was immaculate. A leather briefcase rested on the rear seat beside a neatly folded overcoat. There were no suspicious objects in plain view, no hurried movements, and nothing that matched the growing suspicion Ryan felt. He returned to his patrol vehicle and requested another verification through dispatch, specifically referencing the earlier bolo. A few moments later the dispatcher responded. "Negative on warrants. Registration valid. Driver's license valid. No criminal alerts associated with the registered owner. Be advised, the bolo remains active. Reporting unit has not yet provided additional identifying information." Ryan listened carefully. The response should have reduced his concern. Instead, it reinforced the possibility that the situation had simply not been fully verified. Rather than seeing the lack of evidence as a reason to conclude the encounter, he began viewing it as a reason to continue searching. Dispatch moved on to other radio traffic, but Ryan's attention remained fixed on Elijah, whose quiet confidence somehow unsettled him more than nervousness ever could. "Where are you headed this morning?" Ryan finally asked. Elijah answered with the same measured tone. "To work." Ryan frowned slightly. "Where exactly?" Elijah smiled politely without revealing frustration. "Downtown." The brief answer only deepened Ryan's uncertainty. "What kind of work do you do?" Elijah paused for a moment before replying. "Public service." Ryan folded his arms. "That is not much of an answer." Elijah looked directly at him. "It is an honest one." The exchange remained courteous, yet an invisible tension settled over the sidewalk. A young couple waiting to cross the street glanced toward the flashing patrol lights before quietly moving on. An elderly woman walking her dog slowed briefly, sensing that something unusual was unfolding despite the absence of raised voices. Ryan examined Elijah's driver's license once more. Everything appeared valid. The registration matched the vehicle. Insurance was current. There were no warrants, alerts, or outstanding violations connected to the identification. Each normal result should have narrowed the investigation. Instead, Ryan found himself focusing on the unanswered questions rather than the verified facts. Elijah remained patient. Years spent serving the law had taught him that authority carried enormous responsibility, especially when exercised under public scrutiny. He understood that reacting emotionally would accomplish nothing. Instead, he allowed silence to speak where anger never could. Ryan stepped closer. "Is there anything in this vehicle that I should know about?" Elijah answered immediately. "Nothing unlawful." Ryan searched the older man's face for uncertainty but found none. There was only quiet confidence supported by complete self-control. After another long moment, Ryan made a decision that surprised even the nearby pedestrians who had continued watching from a respectful distance. "Sir, because the earlier broadcast has not yet been fully resolved, I am going to transport you to the precinct while we complete identity verification and determine whether this vehicle is connected to the investigation." The words hung heavily in the crisp autumn air. Elijah neither argued nor resisted. He simply looked at Ryan with calm disappointment rather than fear. "Officer," he said gently, "I hope every decision you make today is based on evidence rather than assumption." Ryan believed department procedure supported his decision, unaware that his judgment had already begun drifting away from the facts that had steadily accumulated in front of him. As he escorted Elijah toward the patrol vehicle, several witnesses quietly exchanged uncertain glances, sensing that the situation felt strangely out of place. Before entering the back seat, Elijah spoke one final sentence with remarkable composure. "I would like the opportunity to make one lawful telephone call at the appropriate time." Ryan acknowledged the request without responding further, closed the rear door, and pulled back into the steady flow of Washington traffic, carrying with him a man whose identity remained unknown to everyone watching, and moving one step closer to the most consequential mistake of his entire career. The patrol vehicle rolled through the busy streets of Washington, District of Columbia, while Elijah Brooks sat quietly in the back seat. Watching familiar government buildings pass beyond the window without revealing the destination that had originally filled his morning schedule. His expression never changed. There was no frustration in his eyes, no attempt to protest, only the quiet patience of a man who understood that truth often required less volume than assumption. Officer Ryan Walker drove with complete confidence, convinced that he was simply following procedure. In his mind, the earlier bolo had not yet been resolved, and until every question was answered, he believed additional verification was justified. Even so, the verified facts had steadily begun outweighing his suspicions. Ryan simply was not ready to accept that possibility. When they arrived at the precinct, Ryan escorted Elijah through the front entrance where officers, administrative staff, and visitors moved through the lobby as another ordinary workday unfolded. A few people glanced toward the older gentleman in the navy suit before returning to their own responsibilities. Elijah remained courteous to everyone he passed, greeting a desk officer with a simple nod before following Ryan toward an interview room rather than the normal booking area. Sergeant Michael Donovan looked up from his paperwork as they entered. His eyes moved from Ryan to Elijah, then back again. "What do we have?" he asked. Ryan answered confidently. "Possible connection to an active bolo." Dispatch cleared his identification, but the originating unit has not provided enough information to eliminate the vehicle. "I need a little more time to verify everything." Michael studied Elijah for a brief moment. The older man stood with remarkable composure, his suit neatly pressed despite the unexpected interruption to his day. There was nothing hurried, aggressive, or disorderly about his appearance. "Did dispatch find anything else?" Michael asked. Ryan shook his head. "Nothing yet. Everything checks out so far, but the bolo is still active." Michael nodded slowly without commenting further, although the explanation seemed to leave him unconvinced. Elijah waited patiently until Ryan finished speaking before addressing the sergeant in a calm voice. "Sir, may I request the opportunity to make one lawful telephone call once department policy permits?" Michael looked toward Ryan. Ryan answered before the sergeant could speak. "Not yet. I still have several questions to resolve." Elijah simply inclined his head. "Very well." Several younger officers working nearby quietly observed the exchange. One whispered to another, "He seems awfully calm." The second officer answered softly, "Either he knows something we do not, or he has absolutely nothing to hide." Ryan ignored the conversation. He escorted Elijah into a private interview room furnished with nothing more than a table, several chairs, and a wall clock whose steady ticking became the loudest sound in the room. Through the observation window, Ryan watched the older man sit comfortably with his hands folded on the table, displaying the same quiet dignity he had shown since the traffic stop began. There was no pacing, no frustration, no visible anxiety. Instead, Elijah glanced briefly at the clock before looking toward the window, fully aware that someone was watching him. Nearly 20 minutes had now passed since the original stop. During that time, Ryan contacted dispatch twice more, but no additional information about the bolo had arrived. The originating unit still had not confirmed a license plate, a driver's description, or any identifying details beyond the vehicle's general appearance. The uncertainty that should have weakened Ryan's suspicion instead convinced him that waiting for complete verification was the safest course. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Susan Keller entered the precinct after returning from a morning meeting. She noticed Ryan reviewing paperwork outside the interview room and asked a simple question. "Who is your guest?" Ryan explained the traffic stop, this time emphasizing the active bolo and the unresolved verification rather than instinct alone. Susan listened carefully before glancing through the observation window herself. She frowned almost imperceptibly. "He does not look like someone trying to hide from the law," she observed. Ryan answered without hesitation. "Looks can be deceiving." Susan remained thoughtful. "Sometimes they can. But so can assumptions." She turned toward Ryan again. "Have you completed identity verification?" "Everything came back clean," Ryan admitted. "No warrants. No alerts. Registration is valid." Susan looked at him for a moment. "Then what exactly are you waiting for?" Ryan hesitated for the first time that morning. Before he could answer, Elijah's calm voice carried through the partially opened door. "Lieutenant, whenever department policy allows, I would still appreciate the opportunity to make that one telephone call." Susan looked toward Ryan, then back at the distinguished gentleman seated inside the room. Something about his quiet confidence made her pause. After another brief moment, she nodded once. "The identity checks are complete. I believe we can accommodate that request." Neither Ryan nor anyone else inside the precinct realized that one routine telephone call, made only after the department had completed its own verification process, would quietly begin a chain of events that would bring the entire precinct to a complete standstill. Lieutenant Susan Keller unlocked the interview room door and offered Elijah Brooks access to the department telephone without ceremony or hesitation. "You may make your call, sir," she said respectfully. Elijah inclined his head with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Lieutenant." He dialed a number from memory with deliberate precision, waiting only a few seconds before a calm voice answered on the other end. "Good morning." Elijah spoke in the same measured tone he had maintained throughout the morning. "This is Elijah Brooks. I need you to verify my location and inform the appropriate office that I have been unexpectedly delayed." There was a brief pause before the voice replied with unmistakable urgency. "Understood, Your Honor. Please remain where you are. We will verify the situation immediately." Elijah simply answered, "Thank you," before ending the call and returning the receiver to its cradle. He did not explain further or ask for special treatment. He quietly resumed his seat inside the interview room with the same patience that had defined every moment since the traffic stop began. Outside the room, Ryan Walker noticed nothing unusual. He continued reviewing his report, carefully documenting each step of the encounter exactly as he remembered it. In his mind, everything remained under control. Sergeant Michael Donovan glanced toward the interview room once more before returning to his paperwork, while Lieutenant Keller continued wondering why the distinguished gentleman seemed so remarkably composed despite the circumstances. Nearly 15 minutes passed without incident. Then the front desk telephone rang. The civilian receptionist answered politely before transferring the call to Lieutenant Keller. "Lieutenant Keller speaking." She listened carefully as the caller identified himself as a senior administrative official from the Supreme Court of the United States. He explained that Justice Elijah Brooks had failed to arrive for scheduled proceedings, that his office had confirmed he was currently at the precinct, and that representatives were attempting to determine exactly what had occurred. Susan's expression changed noticeably, though she remained composed. "Yes, sir," she replied. "Justice Brooks is here. He has been cooperative throughout the entire encounter. We are reviewing the circumstances now." After ending the call, she immediately contacted the chief of police through the chain of command and provided a factual summary of the situation. The chief instructed her to preserve every document, radio transmission, body camera recording, patrol vehicle video, and dispatch log connected to the stop until the matter could be fully reviewed. Within minutes, an official departmental notification arrived through the secure communication system directing precinct leadership to retain all records associated with the incident. Sergeant Donovan quietly stepped beside Susan. "Who exactly is in that interview room?" Before she could answer, another call arrived, this time confirming that representatives from the Administrative Office of the Supreme Court, together with members of the United States Marshal Service responsible for judicial security, were on their way to the precinct. Nearly 20 minutes later, several dark government sport utility vehicles entered the station parking lot in an orderly procession. Their arrival was calm rather than dramatic, but every officer watching through the front windows immediately recognized the distinctive federal license plates. Well-dressed officials stepped out alongside members of the United States Marshal Service, moving toward the entrance with quiet professionalism rather than urgency. The front doors opened, and the senior marshal presented official credentials before speaking in an even voice. "Good afternoon. We are here regarding the temporary investigative detention of Justice Elijah Brooks." An almost perfect silence settled across the precinct. Ryan felt the words echo in his mind before their meaning fully reached him. Justice Elijah Brooks. Not an attorney. Not a government employee. Not an ordinary citizen delayed on his way to work. A justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. In that single moment, every assumption that had guided Ryan's decisions throughout the morning collapsed beneath the weight of one undeniable truth. The quiet gentleman who had remained patient from the very beginning had never asked for special treatment. He had simply expected the same fairness and professionalism that every American citizen deserved. For several long seconds, no one inside the precinct moved. The words spoken by the senior United States Marshal seemed to suspend time itself. Officer Ryan Walker stood motionless, staring toward the interview room as the realization settled heavily upon him. Every assumption he had made during the traffic stop now stood against a single undeniable fact. The quiet man he had viewed with suspicion was Justice Elijah Brooks, a respected member of the Supreme Court of the United States. The marshal spoke calmly, never raising his voice. "Our priority is simply to ensure Justice Brooks is treated with the dignity that every citizen deserves." The sentence landed with unexpected weight. It was not a demand for privilege. It was a reminder of a principle that applied equally to everyone. Moments later, the chief of police arrived at the precinct after being briefed by department leadership. He listened quietly to Lieutenant Susan Keller's factual summary before speaking in a calm but unmistakably firm voice. "Lieutenant, preserve every piece of evidence connected to this incident. Body camera recordings, patrol vehicle video, dispatch communications, written reports, everything. Notify Internal Affairs that an administrative review begins immediately." He then turned toward Ryan. "Officer Walker, until that review is complete, surrender your body camera and department-issued credentials to your supervisor. This is an administrative action, not a disciplinary finding. The facts will determine the outcome." Ryan nodded silently. Without argument, he removed the body camera from his uniform and handed it to Lieutenant Keller along with his department credentials. For the first time in his career, he fully understood the weight of a decision made before all the facts had been gathered. Lieutenant Keller immediately stepped forward. "Please come with me," she said. She unlocked the interview room and opened the door. Elijah rose from his chair with the same composed expression he had carried throughout the morning. He greeted the arriving officials with a polite nod rather than visible relief. One of the marshals smiled respectfully. "Good afternoon, Your Honor." Elijah returned the greeting in an equally measured tone. "Good afternoon. Thank you for coming." There was no anger in his voice, no desire to embarrass anyone in the room. Ryan watched in complete silence as every federal official instinctively stood a little straighter in Elijah's presence. Respect filled the room naturally, not because of fear or authority alone, but because of the character the justice displayed under difficult circumstances. Sergeant Michael Donovan quietly handed Elijah his personal belongings, carefully confirming that everything was present. "Your wallet, your keys, your identification, and your briefcase, sir." Elijah accepted them with a gracious smile. "Thank you, Sergeant." Ryan finally found the courage to step forward. His confidence from earlier that morning had completely disappeared. "Justice Brooks," he began quietly, I did not know who you were." Elijah looked directly into his eyes. "I know that, officer." Ryan swallowed before continuing. "If I had known," Elijah gently interrupted him. "That is precisely the point." The room became perfectly still once again. Elijah's voice remained calm, yet every word carried unmistakable clarity. Respect should never begin after someone learns a title. It should begin the moment two human beings meet. No one spoke. Even the federal officials remained silent, allowing the lesson to settle naturally. Elijah continued. "The Constitution does not promise equal treatment only for judges, elected officials, or people with recognizable names. It promises equal justice for every citizen. That principle becomes meaningful only when ordinary moments test our commitment to it." Ryan lowered his eyes, recognizing that no formal reprimand could have affected him more deeply than those simple words. The chief nodded quietly. "Our review will determine whether department policy was followed. Accountability exists to protect both the public and the integrity of this department." No one disagreed. The room understood that the process ahead would be guided by evidence rather than emotion. Elijah turned toward the marshals, preparing to leave. Before reaching the doorway, he paused one final time and looked back at Ryan. "Officer Walker," he said gently, "today will become part of your career. You alone will decide whether it becomes your greatest failure or your greatest teacher." Ryan nodded slowly, unable to answer immediately. As Justice Elijah Brooks walked through the precinct surrounded by quiet professionalism rather than ceremony, every officer watching understood that genuine authority had never entered the building with flashing lights or raised voices. It had entered with patience, dignity, and the quiet confidence of a man who believed that justice was never measured by how much power someone possessed, but by how fairly they treated the person standing directly in front of them. By the following morning, the atmosphere inside the precinct had changed in ways that no one could ignore. Conversations that usually revolved around patrol assignments and daily reports had quietly shifted toward professionalism, judgment, and accountability. Every piece of evidence connected to the previous day's encounter had been secured according to department policy. Body camera recordings, patrol vehicle video, dispatch communications, and written reports were all forwarded to Internal Affairs for an administrative review. No one rushed to conclusions. Instead, supervisors insisted that every decision be examined through facts rather than assumptions, the very standard that law enforcement expected from the courts every day. Officer Ryan Walker arrived for duty earlier than usual. The confidence that had once defined his posture had been replaced by thoughtful silence. As he walked through the station, familiar faces greeted him politely, but everyone understood that the review would determine whether department procedures had been followed appropriately. Lieutenant Susan Keller invited Ryan into her office and closed the door behind him. Her voice remained calm and professional. "This is not about destroying a career," she said. "It is about understanding every decision that led to yesterday. Accountability exists so that public trust can survive difficult moments." Ryan nodded without attempting to defend himself. For the first time since joining the department, he replayed every minute of the traffic stop in his own mind, recognizing how quickly confidence had turned into certainty without enough supporting evidence. Later that afternoon, Internal Affairs investigators began reviewing the recordings frame by frame. The videos revealed exactly what had happened. Justice Elijah Brooks had remained respectful from the first greeting until the final conversation inside the precinct. His hands had remained visible. His responses had been courteous. His requests had been lawful. Every instruction had been followed without hesitation. The recordings also showed something more difficult to measure but impossible to overlook. Several opportunities had existed for the encounter to end peacefully much earlier. Each of those moments quietly passed because assumptions continued to outweigh observable facts. Meanwhile, Justice Brooks continued his responsibilities at the Supreme Court without making public statements or seeking attention. When asked privately by a trusted colleague whether he intended to file a personal complaint, he simply replied, "The review process already exists." Institutions earn trust when they are allowed to uphold their own principles with honesty. His answer reflected the same dignity he had demonstrated throughout the entire encounter. Back at the precinct, Chief Daniel Harrison gathered supervisors for a leadership meeting. He reminded them that public confidence depended not only upon enforcing the law but also upon demonstrating fairness during ordinary encounters. "People remember how we treat them long before they remember the outcome," he said. "Professionalism begins before suspicion, not after certainty." Those words spread quickly throughout the department, becoming part of conversations in briefing rooms, patrol cars, and training sessions. Ryan spent the remainder of the day reviewing his own body camera footage alone in a quiet office. Watching events unfold from his own perspective proved far more difficult than he expected. He noticed details he had overlooked in real time, including Elijah's calm cooperation, measured responses, and repeated willingness to comply with every lawful request. The recording contained no dramatic confrontation, only a series of small decisions that gradually led to a much larger consequence. As the video reached its conclusion, Ryan paused the screen and remained seated in silence. He finally understood that the greatest lessons in policing rarely arrived through danger or excitement. They arrived during ordinary moments when character quietly guided every choice. Outside the station, another patrol shift was beginning across Washington. Officers answered calls, directed traffic, and served their communities just as they always had. Inside one quiet office, however, a single officer had begun learning that true authority was never measured by the power to stop someone on the street, but by the wisdom to recognize the equal dignity of every person before making the next decision. Several days later, the formal administrative review continued exactly as department policy required, but the most meaningful conversation surrounding the incident happened far away from conference rooms, reports, and evidence files. Officer Ryan Walker received an unexpected invitation through Lieutenant Susan Keller. Justice Elijah Brooks had agreed to meet privately, not as part of an investigation, not before reporters or attorneys, but simply as two public servants whose responsibilities had intersected under unfortunate circumstances. The meeting took place inside a quiet conference room at a federal building overlooking the familiar streets of Washington. There were no television cameras waiting outside, no audience hoping for confrontation, and no prepared statements resting on the table. Ryan entered with visible humility, uncertain whether an apology would be enough. Elijah stood as Ryan approached and extended his hand with quiet courtesy. Ryan accepted it gratefully. "Thank you for agreeing to see me, Justice Brooks," he said. Elijah smiled gently. "Please sit down, Officer Walker." For a few moments, neither man spoke. Sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting long reflections across the polished table as the city continued its busy rhythm beyond the glass. Ryan finally broke the silence. "I have replayed that morning more times than I can count. I keep asking myself how I allowed assumptions to replace evidence." Elijah listened without interruption before answering. "That question tells me you have already begun learning something many people never do." Ryan looked up. "I embarrassed you. I failed to treat you fairly." Elijah slowly shook his head. "You made a decision that affected me, but the larger issue reaches beyond one individual. Imagine if I had simply been an ordinary citizen going to an ordinary job. Would that person deserve any less patience, any less respect, or any less fairness?" Ryan lowered his eyes once again because he already knew the answer. "No, sir." Elijah leaned forward slightly. "Title should never determine the quality of justice. My position did not create my dignity. It merely made the mistake impossible to ignore." The words settled heavily in the quiet room. Ryan realized that the greatest lesson from the encounter had never been about arresting the wrong person. It had been about beginning the encounter with the wrong mindset. Elijah continued. Every day you wear a badge, someone you meet may be experiencing the most stressful moment of their life. They will remember your first words long after they forget your name. Your authority allows you to enforce the law. Your character determines whether people trust that authority. Ryan nodded slowly. I understand that now. Elijah smiled warmly. Understanding is only the first step. Consistency is what transforms understanding into integrity. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, touching on public service, responsibility, and the importance of humility in positions of authority. There were no accusations, only thoughtful reflection shared between two men committed in different ways to protecting the principles of American justice. As they stood to leave, Ryan extended his hand once more. Thank you for giving me a chance to learn instead of simply remembering me for my mistake. Elijah shook his hand firmly. Every institution becomes stronger when its people are willing to grow. The law is not honored because its servants are perfect. It is honored because they continue striving to become better than they were yesterday. Ryan walked out of the building carrying no certificate, no official commendation, and no promise that the administrative review would change its course. Instead, he carried something far more valuable, the quiet understanding that genuine justice begins long before a courtroom, long before a verdict, and long before anyone asks for identification. It begins in the first moment one human being chooses to see another with equal dignity. The administrative review reached its conclusion several weeks later, and although the findings remained confidential as required by department policy, one outcome became visible to everyone inside the Metropolitan Police Department. Officer Ryan Walker returned to active patrol with a renewed understanding of the responsibility carried by every uniformed officer. His badge had not changed. His patrol car looked exactly the same. The streets of Washington, District of Columbia, continued moving with their familiar rhythm. What had changed was the way he approached every person he encountered. During his first week back on regular patrol, Ryan noticed a sedan pulled safely onto the shoulder with a flat tire during the afternoon rush hour. Instead of assuming the worst or rushing through the encounter, he parked behind the vehicle, activated his emergency lights for safety, and walked forward with a calm expression. A young black mother stood beside the car while her teenage son searched the trunk for the spare tire. The woman appeared relieved when Ryan greeted her with a simple smile. Good afternoon. Is everyone all right? She nodded gratefully. Yes, officer. We are just trying to figure this out. Ryan offered assistance, helping them contact roadside service and ensuring they remained safely away from passing traffic. Before leaving, the woman thanked him sincerely. You made a stressful afternoon much easier. Ryan smiled modestly. I am glad I could help. Please stay safe. As he returned to his patrol vehicle, he realized that genuine public service often happened in quiet moments that never appeared in reports or headlines. Days later, another routine traffic stop tested the lesson even further. Ryan observed a minor equipment violation and activated his emergency lights. The driver immediately pulled over. As Ryan approached, he consciously remembered the conversation with Justice Elijah Brooks. He greeted the driver respectfully, explained the reason for the stop, listened carefully to every response, and verified the necessary information before reaching a fair conclusion supported by facts alone. The encounter ended with a warning, clear communication, and mutual respect. Neither person left feeling diminished. Inside the precinct, fellow officers gradually noticed subtle differences in Ryan's approach. Younger officers occasionally rode with him during field training, and they watched how he slowed down before making important decisions. He asked more questions than before. He listened more carefully. He remained alert without allowing suspicion to replace evidence. One afternoon, Lieutenant Susan Keller observed Ryan completing another professional traffic stop from a distance. Afterward, she approached him in the parking lot. You handled that well, she said. Ryan answered honestly. I realized that the first decision I make is not whether someone is guilty. The first decision is whether I will treat them with dignity while I learn the facts. Susan nodded with quiet approval. That lesson cannot be fully taught in an academy. Sometimes life becomes the instructor. Across the city, Justice Elijah Brooks continued serving on the Supreme Court with the same humility that had defined his career long before their paths crossed. He never spoke publicly about the incident, nor did he seek recognition for the quiet lesson it had become. For him, justice had always been larger than any single encounter. It lived through institutions willing to improve and individuals willing to examine themselves honestly. Ryan occasionally thought back to that autumn morning whenever he drove past the stretch of road where everything had begun. The memory no longer filled him with embarrassment alone. Instead, it reminded him that every encounter offered a new opportunity to choose patience over assumption, professionalism over pride, and fairness over impulse. The city remained unchanged, but one officer now understood that the strongest foundation of justice was never built through authority alone. It was built one respectful conversation at a time, long before anyone ever learned another person's name or title. Several months passed, and the events of that autumn morning gradually disappeared from public conversation, but they never disappeared from the lives of the two men whose paths had crossed so unexpectedly. Washington, District of Columbia, continued moving with its familiar rhythm. The Supreme Court heard new cases that would shape the future of the nation, while police officers answered calls, directed traffic, and served neighborhoods throughout the city. Life had returned to normal on the surface, yet something important had quietly changed beneath it. One evening, Officer Ryan Walker was invited to speak during a community outreach program. Attended by local residents, new police recruits, civic leaders, and representatives from several public service organizations. The event focused on building trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Standing before the audience without prepared remarks, Ryan chose honesty over perfection. "I used to believe experience meant I could recognize every situation before it unfolded," he admitted. "Then one ordinary traffic stop taught me that assumptions can never replace evidence, and authority can never replace respect." The room remained silent as people listened carefully. Ryan did not mention every detail of the encounter or seek sympathy for his mistakes. Instead, he described the lesson that had stayed with him ever since. The first words an officer speaks often matter more than the last decision an officer makes. Every person deserves professionalism from the very beginning, not after we learn who they are. Among those seated near the back of the room was Justice Elijah Brooks, attending quietly at the invitation of community organizers rather than as a featured speaker. He wore another simple suit without any indication of his position, just as he always preferred. Most people in the audience never realized who he was. He listened attentively as Ryan spoke, seeing not the confident officer from months earlier but a public servant who had allowed accountability to become growth instead of resentment. After the program concluded, attendees gathered to shake hands and continue conversations. Ryan noticed Elijah standing nearby and walked over with a genuine smile. "Justice Brooks," he said warmly, "it is good to see you again." Elijah returned the smile. "It is good to see you as well, Officer Walker." Ryan looked around the room where officers and citizens spoke comfortably together. "I hope I honored the lesson you shared with me." Elijah answered without hesitation. "You honored it the moment you chose to live it instead of merely remembering it." They shook hands once more, not as strangers separated by misunderstanding, nor as opponents divided by authority, but as two men committed to the same ideal from different callings. As they stepped outside, the evening sun settled behind the monuments of the nation's capital, casting long golden light across the streets where countless ordinary encounters would continue every day. Somewhere nearby, another patrol officer was beginning a shift. Somewhere else, another citizen was driving home from work. Neither knew the story that had quietly reshaped one officer's understanding of justice. Yet its influence continued through every respectful greeting, every patient question, and every decision guided by evidence instead of assumption. Justice Elijah Brooks walked toward the Supreme Court, while Ryan Walker returned to his patrol vehicle, each carrying forward the responsibilities entrusted to them. They traveled different roads, but both understood the same enduring truth. A badge can grant authority, and a title can command respect, but neither has lasting meaning without character. In the end, karma did not arrive through humiliation or revenge. It arrived through accountability, humility, and the courage to become better than the person who made the mistake. And perhaps that is the strongest form of justice, because the law protects society, but character gives the law its heart. Real justice is not measured by the title someone holds or the authority they carry. It is measured by the fairness, respect, and dignity we choose to show every person before we know who they are. That is what makes trust possible, and that is what gives the law its true meaning. Stories like this remind us that a single decision can shape a career, change a life, and leave a lesson that lasts far beyond one difficult day. What do you think is the most important quality every law enforcement officer should have? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time on HOA Stories.